So today we're looking at the second part of religious language, which are the 20th century perspective and philosophical comparisons. So this includes all your parables, verification, falsification, Hare, flu, Hare, Hick, Mitchell, and Wittgenstein. This is chapter 1.9 in the OCR ALevel Religious Studies specification. So as usual, pause the video and see whether you can define these key terms before we go into them. So empirical. This is available to be experienced by the five senses. So for example, your eyes, you can taste it, you can see it, you can smell it, you can feel it, you can hear it. Cognitive is having a factual quality that is available to knowledge, where words are labels for things in the world. Non-cognitive is having a factual quality that is available to knowledge. Words are tools used to achieve something rather than labels for things. So this topic really looks into the differences of whether religious language can be known cognitively or non-cognitively. So really familiarize yourself with these definitions of cognitive. So something that can be either true by definition or it can be empirical, so experienced by the five senses, and we'll go into this more in detail. Whilst non-cognitive is not that, it's something other than that, so it's not true or false, and we can't verify it using our five senses, but it still causes some belief and meaning to people. Logical positivism is a movement that claimed that assertions have to be capable of being tested empirically if they are to be meaningful. Verification is providing evidence to determine that something is true, whilst falsification is providing evidence to determining that something is false. So just a recap of what this topic is. And firstly, we have to look into what analytic and synthetic statements are. So, analytic statement is a statement of definition. It tells us how words are being used, and it does not need any experience to support it. So, examples that I always give here are something like 1 + 1 = 2. This is because 2 means 1 + 1 and 1 + 1 = 2. It's a circular argument. This means that. And it's the same with definitions. So something like all bachelors are unmarried men. I'm not going to write it down because it takes too long. But all bachelors are unmarried men. A bachelor means an unmarried man, and an unmarried man means a bachelor. Again, we don't get anything more from that, but just the definition itself. Then we have synthetic statements, and these add something to our knowledge and can be used to support it. So this is something like, it's raining outside. So with this kind of claim, excuse my appalling handwriting, we can verify or falsify whether it's raining outside. So I can look outside and I can see whether it is raining or whether it's not raining. So in this sense, synthetic statements don't have to be true by definition. They can be false as long as I use my empirical senses and experience in order to verify it. Whilst analytic statements have to be true by definition, because if 1 + 1 I said = 3, that would be wrong. So therefore this has to be true by definition, and this has to use some experience. And this is what basically we're going to be saying that cognitive languages, what cognitive approaches to language being meaningful is. It either has to be analytic statement or it has to be a synthetic statement. And non-cognitive statements won't be either of those, and that's what some philosophers argue religious language is. So, like I said, in the context of religious language, let's just take this out. In the context of religious language, there are questions about whether religious truth claims have to be supported by empirical evidence if they are to be actually meaningful. So now we have more about cognitive and non-cognitive uses of language. So, like I said, cognitive uses of language involve things that can be known and that could be either true or false. Whilst non-cognitive uses of language are not about things that can be known, but instead act in other ways. So, for example, they might express emotions, ask questions, give commands, or make assertions. They're not necessarily true or false. Cognitive uses of language have to be either analytically true or synthetically true, either one of those. Non-cognitive doesn't need to be analytically or synthetically true. It can be just a feeling. And we'll go into these examples in a minute. But in the context of religious language, whatever question you get for this, it's going to ask whether religious statements should be understood as cognitively true or meaningful or non-cognitively meaningful. So really, really familiarize yourself with what cognitive and non-cognitive is, and then all the parables and everything else will fall into that. So now we have the movement of logical positivism A.J. Hare was a leading figure of. So it began in the early 20th century with discussions among the Vienna Circle, and that was just a group of people, and they wanted to clarify the kinds of statements that they have meaning and the kinds which only sound meaningful but are actually empty. So they presented a challenge to religious believers by claiming that religious language is not true or false, but actually meaningless. And A.J. Hare led this challenge in his book Language, Truth and Logic in 1936. And Hare came up with the verification principle. So according to logical positivists, a proposition is only meaningful if it is analytic, like 1 + 1 = 2, or if it's capable of being tested using the 5 senses, such as it is raining outside. I can verify it by looking out the window. So this is known as the verification principle. That's all the verification principle is. Something is either analytically true or synthetically true to be meaningful. But Hare dismissed religious language as meaningless because claims such as God made the world can't be tested empirically. So I can't go back in time and see whether God made the world. And they're not true by definition because it's not true by definition that God had to make the world. Some people might argue against that, but in Hare's case, he said it's not. But there is a massive criticism of the verification principle. Many people reject it because it fails its own test. It cannot itself be tested empirically or analytically. So therefore, the verification principle itself is meaningless, and should religious believers even think about it, because it's not itself meaningful. So yes, the verification principle fails its own test, which is a very big criticism of it. So it classifies as meaningless and a lot more than religious language, because ethical statements, for example, cannot be verified empirically, whilst the verification principle should be verified empirically. And weaker versions of the verification principle have also been suggested, but we don't need to go into those. Wittgenstein and language games, and here he is on the left. So Ludwig Wittgenstein was a 20th century philosopher who aimed to work out the limits of what can be known, conceptualized and expressed in language. And he explored the ways in which language can have meaning, and not only religious language, but all forms of language. And his work inspired the Vienna Circle into seeing whether religious language had meaning or not. So he came up with this concept of language games. And he thought we can understand how language can be meaningful if we think of using the analogy of a game. So, language is meaningful to people who use it when they are participating in a shared language game. So, for example, when people play chess, if you understand the rules of chess, chess has meaning to you. Where I place the different chess pieces have meaning, and you'll be able to play back. But if you don't understand chess and you don't know the rules of chess, then it has absolutely no meaning to you. I also like to use the analogy of learning a foreign language. So for example, if you understand French, then French words have a meaning to you. But if you don't understand French, when someone's speaking in French, it will have no meaning to you at all. So in this way, it's basically just saying if someone understands the rules of the game, or of the language, then it has meaning to you. But if you don't, then it's meaningless. But just because it doesn't mean anything to you doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything to other people. So therefore, this meaning is subjective. And Wittgenstein used this word of a Lebensform, or in English, a form of life. So in a context in which language might be used. So language has meaning in context. So people outside of the context might not understand it easily. So basically with the language things that I said. So with the Lebensform, there are rules for language usage and everyone understands them. And I like to use this umbrella analogy as well. So if you're underneath the umbrella, you obviously won't get wet. Side of it, then you will get wet. So in the same way, if you understand the rules of chess, you're under the umbrella, but everyone else doesn't, is outside the umbrella. So therefore, you can talk about the meaningfulness here and the non-meaningfulness here. But just because people don't see it meaningful doesn't mean that these people under the umbrella don't. And this can be understood in religious language as well, because people who, for example, are religious are under the umbrella or the Lebensform of religion. So any religious language such as God exists, God made the world, God is love, will all be understood by religious believers under this umbrella. So just because atheists might not agree with it doesn't mean it's not meaningful to this group of people. So these propositions such as God exists are not simply meaningful or meaningless to everyone, but they can have some meaning to some people, but have no meaning to other people. So like I said, this meaning is subjective rather than universal. So religious language can therefore be meaningful to those who are in the Lebensform of religion, even if they are meaningless to those outside of it. So later thinkers have adapted this thinking of Wittgenstein to suggest that religious language can be meaningful non-cognitively, because it's not saying that religious language is true or false, it's saying it's something else. It's saying if you understand what it is, then it has meaning to you. So it might make you behave in a different way. So for example, Jews and Muslims don't eat pork, or Christians don't eat meat on a Friday. Or you might believe specific aspects that have meaning to you and you do. So for example, when religious believers pray, that what they say will have tremendous meaning to them. And when their relatives dies, for example, if they believe in an afterlife, then that will have tremendous meaning to them. And that again is non-cognitive in Wittgenstein's form. And then we have Flew and the falsification principle. So Flew's ideas were presented at a symposium in Oxford in a paper called Theology and Falsification in 1950. And he wanted to take the debate about meaningfulness of religious language into a new territory. So he had the idea of the parable of the gardener by John Wisdom. So Flew used the parable by John Wisdom to illustrate his argument. A skeptic and a believer have different views about the existence of a gardener who visits a clearing in the jungle because the gardener cannot be detected using the five senses. So we have the believer here and the skeptic. And they both walk into this garden, and the believer says there must be a gardener that tends to this. But the skeptic says, well, we can't see one. So the believer says, well, he must be invisible. And then the skeptic says, but we can't smell them, or the dogs that they had with them couldn't smell the gardener. And the believer said, well, that's because he's not smellable. And then the skeptic said, well, we can't hear him, so there probably isn't one. And the believer said, well, that's because he's inaudible. So again, all these different things, he's basically saying no matter what the skeptic poses as a criticism, the believer always says that an invisible gardener exists. So nothing the skeptic offers as evidence against the existence of the gardener will ever convince the believer, who in response to the skeptic keeps qualifying his statements about the characteristics of the invisible gardener to accommodate each challenge. So he's not stepping down at all, no matter how much evidence is pointed against his belief of the invisible gardener existing. And because of this, Flew argues that religious believers behave in the same way, refusing to accept any counter-evidence to the claims about God. And Flew says that religious truth claims end with a death by 1,000 qualifications. And I would use this quote in your exam because it's directly from Flew. And with this, he's basically saying that no matter how many things can go against the belief, the believer will always give you an counter evidence to support their claim, and they will give you qualifications after qualifications after qualifications until they die, modified until they assert nothing. So he says that a statement must be, and in principle, falsifiable if it is to be meaningful at all. So we have to know what evidence, if any, could count against our assertions if they are to have any meaning at all. So the example I always give here is, my pen is blue. You can clearly see that it's red. But it's falsifiable because you can use your senses in order to see that my pen is red and not blue. So therefore the statement is meaningful because you just have to give a hypothetical reason for it to be falsifiable. And that's what he's saying religious believers don't do. So that's why religious language is meaningless, because no matter how much the skeptic tells the believer of why God might not exist, he doesn't believe him and doesn't even think about a reason why he shouldn't exist. There's never any doubt, whilst there needs to be some form of doubt in order for something to be falsifiable. So there is a big criticism of flu, and it's the problem of evil. So religious believers can doubt the existence of God through the problem of evil, but they choose to continue believing in God with their faith despite there being evil. So this kind of shows that religious language or religious belief can be falsifiable hypothetically. So it's a big criticism against it, and we'll see it applied to one of the parables later on. So religious believers can falsify their beliefs, so therefore religious language can be meaningful cognitively because it's falsifiable. But we have responses to flu, and there's going to be 3 different parables that respond directly to flu. And the first one is the parable of the paranoid lunatic. So Hare responded to flu by saying that we all have falsifiable blicks. So the parable that he gave, that there is a student and at a university, and he believes that the university professors, or dons as they are called in the parable, are going to kill him. That's what his belief is, that all the professors are going to kill him. Despite how many people have told him that the professors aren't going to kill him, he continues to believe that. So that is his blick, what Hare calls. So he said that it's a way of framing and understanding the world. His framing and understanding the world is that the university professors are going to kill him. So in this way, he's saying that religious belief is religious believers' blick, is how they understand the world. So theism is unfalsifiable, but so is atheism, because atheism is also a blick. So Hare gives a story of a paranoid lunatic who believes his university professor is going to murder him in order to illustrate his argument and show that we all have subjective ways of understanding the world. Whenever you give these parables, you need to say who represents what. So the student obviously represents the religious believer, the university professor just is the world, and the blicks represent religious belief. So clarify what each thing represents in your essay. So through that, Hare is suggesting that religious belief and religious claims are non-cognitive expressions of preference, because he's saying that no matter what evidence can count against your claim or your belief, it still causes you to act differently, or for you to behave in a specific way, or for you to think in a specific way. And that is subjectively meaningful to the individual, rather than a universal approach. So again, non-cognitive. But before we go on, there is a massive criticism of this particular parable, because by calling a religious belief a blick is very offensive to religious believers, because in specific religions such as Christianity, it has to be true it has to be true that Jesus died and resurrected for there to be an afterlife. So therefore, by calling it a blick is very insensitive to the religion itself. So it's a criticism that you could have there. Then we have Basil Mitchell's parable of the stranger. So Mitchell responded to flu by saying that we have to make commitments to trust and believe in things even when evidence is ambitious or lacking. So he gave the story of a partisan in wartime to illustrate his point and showed that sometimes it is necessary to have faith despite some counter evidence. So Mitchell's parable was this. There was a partisan and he met a stranger. So this was set during World War II. Partisan made a stranger. And the stranger said, I am on your side. And the partisan believed the stranger. But the partisan's friends saw the stranger cooperating and working for the other side, so the enemy in this instance. But despite this, the partisan believed the stranger of what he said, that he was on his side, and it turned out that the stranger was on his side. So who represents what here? The partisan is a religious believer. The stranger is God. The friends are just observers. And him working for the other side or the other enemy represents this falsification. It's the problem of evil example that you could give here, because it's despite there being some evidence against the claim that the stranger was on his side, he still chose to believe it. So in this way, it's showing that it was falsifiable because there was something that could go against his claim to illustrate that it was false, but he still chose to believe in it. So that it shows falsification. So therefore, he argued that religious language is cognitive, even if there are not possible, available, ready facts to support their belief. So the faith aspect. So it has to be, so religious language is cognitively meaningful because there is evidence that goes against the claim. So this is the hardest parable to understand. So do go over it a few times, but don't worry if you don't get it first time. Just really ensure that you know who represents what and why and what it's showing. It's showing falsification to show that religious language is cognitively meaningful. And lastly, we have Hick's parable of the celestial city. So Hick illustrates the story here. Two men are travelling together alongside a road. One of them believes that it leads to the celestial city and the other that it leads nowhere. But since this is the only road where there is, both must travel on it. And neither has even been this way before, and therefore neither is able to say what they will find around the corner. During their journey, they meet up with moments of refreshment and delight, and with moments of hardship and danger. All the time, one of them thinks of the journey as a pilgrimage to the celestial city, and the other, however, believes that none of this, and believes their journey is an unavoidable and endless ramble. However, when they turn the last corner, it will be apparent that one of them has been right all along and the other has been wrong. So what is this trying to show? What does the celestial city here represent? It represents heaven. So one of the men that believes is obviously the believer in this, and the one that doesn't is the skeptic, and therefore the atheist. The journey itself is life, so the life that they live. The moments of refreshment and delight are the ups in life that we have. So for example, people get married, the wonderful lives that they do, the careers that they have, births of children, whilst the hardships and danger might be something like deaths, illness, not getting the promotion you wanted, hardness in school, all of those kind of things. And the last corner represents death. So what Hick is saying is that when we die, we will know, and we will be able to either verify that there is a heaven or the afterlife, God exists, or we'll be able to falsify it, that it doesn't exist, so therefore it's wrong. So this is called eschatological verification, and eschatology is anything to do with the afterlife and death. So think about it in those terms. And this is a really good parable to illustrate that religious language is, again, cognitively meaningful, because it's both verifiable and falsifiable. So it goes with the verification principle, and it goes with Flu's falsification principle. So now we have comparison of Wittgenstein and Aquinas from the OCR syllabus. So Wittgenstein and Aquinas are similar in the ways they both address problems of religious language. And they both take a position that does not dismiss the possibility that religious language has meaning. but they have some differences. So the first one is that Aquinas tackled issues raised in the 13th century of how religious language could be meaningful without making God too small, if you think about why he uses analogies, which is in my previous video on religious language. And Wittgenstein tackled issues in the 20th century of whether religious language could be meaningful about being empirically verifiable. So again, you see the differences here. Wittgenstein also wasn't a theist himself, but he just thought that it still had meaning. Aquinas proposed thinking in terms of analogy, but Wittgenstein proposed ideas of language games. Aquinas took a cognitive approach to religious language, believing that religious language refers to factual truth, whilst Wittgenstein took a more non-cognitive approach to religious language, concentrating on how it is used in context and is subjective, whilst Aquinas was how it was universal, because facts are universal. There are influences of non-cognitive approaches to religious language on the interpretation of sacred texts. So non-cognitive approaches to religious texts have become more popular in the 20th century, and they suggest that instead of interpreting texts as the Bible as factual historical accounts, it's more helpful to understand them in other ways, such as tools for learning and coming to a personal decision about spiritual matters. So it's basically saying that rather than taking the Bible, for example, as historical facts, to take more as myths, maybe tools to help you understand things and learn lessons from, rather than believing in the six-day creation, a story, for example. Altman suggested demythologizing the Bible, by which he meant looking past stories with magical or miraculous content and seeing the Bible as calling people to make personal decisions. So again, he thought that the virgin birth story of Mary becoming pregnant with Jesus, the resurrection, all of the miracles of Jesus, can't be looked as magical or mysterious and miracles, but rather there's something else behind it. So again, it's a methodological aspect. But again, it's not a very popular concept within Christianity today. Other thinkers have suggested seeing the Bible in other non-cognitive ways, so emphasizing the decisions and attitudes people might take in their lives. Things like the struggles of Jesus as a teaching of how to help you overcome struggles yourself, rather than believing that you could go to an afterlife, possibly. So books such as Honest to God and The Myth of God Incarnate controversy in their suggestions that ideas such as God incarnate need not to be understood as factually true. So possibly Jesus wasn't God incarnate. All these ideas. But again, it just goes very much against the Christian understanding of what Christianity really is. So cognitive approaches to biblical texts continue to be most popular among Christians, and non-cognitive ones are just very rare. Because it has to be, for most Christians, has to be factually true that Jesus died, was resurrected, specific miracles had to happen. Maybe six-day creation story is more of a myth, that Catholics take that more as a myth, for example, because they allow for things like evolution to take step in between that. So there may be aspects of the Bible that could be taken as myth, but other aspects have to be taken as it is. So it might be a mixture of non-cognitive and cognitive, possibly. Now you can pause the video and test your knowledge, and if you know all the answers to these questions, then you know all the AO1 knowledge for these topics. Time for some exam questions, because practice makes perfect. So this question, to what extent can Wittgenstein's story of language games help to resolve the issue raised by religious believers? I would start here with obviously your introduction, introducing the key terms of what cognitive, non-cognitive means, and then I would go into the non-cognitive first. So illustrate what Wittgenstein meant by language games, and you can then support that with the parable of the paranoid lunatic. You can then criticize this with verification and falsification, then go through all the parables, and then you can say which one was better on your conclusion. Whilst this question, a non-cognitive approach to religious language, provides valuable insights into interpretations of religious texts. I would start quite similar, because it's asking about non-cognitive approaches first. But then you could see whether they're valuable into interpretation of texts. So we would talk about here maybe some of the miracle story, so resurrection, virgin birth story, creation story, and see how it might be more appropriate for religious believers to believe them as a non-cognitive approach. And then you can argue through a cognitive approach, so go through all the falsification, verification, and say how that might be more useful and meaningful within religious text, and then conclude whether you think it's better with non-cognitive or cognitive approaches. So thanks for joining me for Religious Language Part 2 today, and join me next time for more philosophy, ethics, and religious studies.